Continue with Scott McClellan's first primetime interview about his revelatory book, What Happened. First, as preface, more reaction today. The former campaign director for President Bush's 2004 re-election campaign, Mike Turk, emailed the HuffingtonPost.com to say Scott McClellan is, quote, getting savaged for saying what everyone knows to be true, adding people had high hopes for President Bush to bring America together after his election and after the attacks on 9/11. They felt disillusioned by the administration's adoption of the win-at-all-costs partisan mentality in this town. I think the bigger point of Scott's book comes from the lessons he learned while playing a part in the permanent campaign. It's an exploration of how that mindset can lead to some really bad choices. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Turk appears to be the only former Bush appointee sticking up for Mr. McClellan. Secretary of State Rice, while technically refusing to talk about the book itself, went on to take on its major premise, telling reporters in Sweden today, quote, you can't now transplant yourself into the present and say we should have known things that we in fact did not know in 2001, 2002, 2003. The record on weapons of mass destruction was one that appeared to be very clear. Speaking of clear, the reaction from Mr. McClellan's former colleagues in the White House could not be more so. His former boss, Ari Fleischer, initially slightly sympathetic, saying today, quote, poor Scott. Scott's about to borrow some friends for 24 hours on the political left who will throw him out as soon as they're done with him, and he's burnt an awful lot of bridges to people who really always thought fondly and highly of him. As promised, Scott McClellan is back with me here in New York. Those reactions, have there been worse? Are you at risk? Has it been worse than just nasty words?
Well, I think it's to be expected. It's certainly a little surprising how personal some of the words have been. But, you know, the White House would prefer that I'm not out there talking openly and honestly about these very issues. I felt it was very important to go back and reflect on this and openly address these issues, my time and experience at the White House, and what I learned from it, so that we hopefully can move beyond these partisan excesses that have existed over the last 15 years because of the permanent campaign mentality that exists in Washington, D.C.
Have you been surprised that most of the criticism has been personal as opposed to, say, refuting facts that perhaps you got right and nobody wants to talk about that?
I have noticed that. There are two things I would say with that. One, some of the people that are making those comments are almost trying to judge the content of the book, judge me and my motivations for writing the book, and they haven't even read the book. And the second, which you bring up, is that I haven't seen people refuting specific parts within the book. Dan Bartlett earlier today, when we were he was doing an interview right after me or in between segments with me, said, well, we need to set the leak episode to the side. And the other day he said, well, no, I'm not going to talk about the Katrina part because that's internal deliberations. So I did find that very interesting.
Crossing off 9/11 in Iraq, and that's pretty much the entire presidency,
well, yeah,
is it not?
There you go.
Everybody else has reacted to this book. Here's your chance. You had rapped Richard Clarke when he came out just before the 2004 election for criticizing the president. Your question to him was, why wait so long? Why didn't this epiphany, this kind of public version of the epiphany, as a book, as an admission, as testimony somewhere, why did it wait till now? Why didn't it happen in some way in 2004, 2005?
Sure.
Or
well, some of you mentioned earlier in one of those email responses, the one to the Huffington Post. But I went into this very much believing that the president was someone committed to being a bipartisan leader and that he was going to reach across the aisle and that he was going to change the way things worked in Washington, D.C. And I had high hopes that he would be able to do that. I was deputy press secretary during the build-up to the war. Like a lot of Americans, I wasn't certain about the rush to war, that it was the right thing to do. From a moral standpoint, I believe we should not be going to war unless it is absolutely necessary. And we now know that it was not absolutely necessary with regards to Iraq. It was not the grave and gathering danger that we portrayed it as. But I also, like a lot of Americans, was in that post-9/11 mindset and gave the president and his foreign policy team the benefit of the doubt. They had been widely applauded for what we had accomplished in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 in terms of going into Afghanistan and removing the Taliban and some of the other steps were taken. So, you know, at that point in time, I was very much putting my trust in the president and his team and what was being said. As I left the White House, my last 10 months became a period of disillusionment, beginning with the Rove revelations that he had been involved in the leak episode, and ending with the revelation that the president had authorized the secret leaking of the National Intelligence Estimate, or at least parts of it. And so I was becoming more disillusioned. And then when I left the White House, I think I needed time to step back and take off that partisan hat and really reflect on this. I wanted to think through, why did things get so badly off track? And I did that. I spent a good bit of time thinking about this, writing the book. The book was actually supposed to be out a little bit sooner, but I wanted to make sure I got this right and that it reflected my views very clearly, and that they were accurately reflected throughout the book. This book does. These are very much the views that I hold today after looking back and reflecting on things and learning from it.
All right. But Karl Rove says, and Dana Perino says, and quotes the president as saying, well, we never heard you express any of that stuff while you were here. Dan Abrams made a pretty good point here on his show last night. Whistleblowers or people who are not happy in an environment and see something wrong with it may make an internal attempt to correct things, or maybe they won't. But they don't usually stand there for 10 months batting their heads against the wall saying, I can make this better if I complain enough. What would have happened to you if you had gone to somebody above you and said, we are misleading the American public about, just fill in the blank, Iraq, Valerie Plame, even 9/11, we're misleading to some degree. What would have happened to you and to the government?
Well, it would have been interesting. I don't know, since that didn't happen, but there was not a lot of let me step back, I guess, a little bit, because and go back through some of that period again. Again, I continued to believe in this president as we were going into war and the immediate aftermath, and when I took over as White House press secretary. But if you go back and read one of the chapters in the book, I talk about becoming White House press secretary, and I had some qualms. I delayed the announcement because I was concerned about whether or not I could do the job the way I wanted to do it. I was coming in the middle of, or as we were gearing up for an election year, and I knew that no one wanted to change the way things were being done, that they wanted to continue that position to continue basically operating the way it had been operating, and not getting too out front of the president, not making a lot of news, and so forth. So I did have those qualms, but I made the decision that this was a unique opportunity, and made the decision to go forward with it.
One other reaction to this that I'd like to get your reaction to, Congressman Wexler, who suggested that after what you have said here, that you should be testifying to Congress about this administration. Do you agree with him, and would you?
One, I don't know that there's much more benefit to me going before Congress. I haven't really thought about it. I'm glad to share my views, and I share them fully in this book. I'm not sure exactly what he's calling for me to talk about, but everything I know about the leak episode is in this book, so I really haven't spent time thinking about it.
Scott McClellan also writes of, quote, propaganda, how he was used, how as a result you were used, when our interview continues next on Countdown.